Hey guys, welcome to the Gun Shop with me, John, and we have Nick Horton here back with us today to do a getting started for wildfowling. He knows a significant amount more than most other people out there. Expert, perhaps?
Wouldn't go as far as to say an expert. If an X is a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure, then I know a bit about it.
How does one start wildfowling? Standard subject, how do you go, where do you go about it, what gear do you need, and what's different about it to other shooting sports?
Okay, starting at the top, I suppose a definition of wildfowling and how it differs from other forms of shooting might help. It's described as the pursuit of ducks and geese with a smooth bore shotgun below the mean high water mark. So we're talking about the coast. Duck shooting and goose shooting inland is just that, duck shooting and goose shooting rather than purist wildfowling.
Did people go out with them after them with rifles at one point?
I think they have. I think if you look back through history and particularly in different geographic areas, they've been taken with every conceivable weapon that you can think of. I mean, again, we talk about wildfowling with a gun. Wildfowling with a gun, you can trace the history of it back to the early 1600s, possibly the late 1500s, when
very early, hoping for the best.
When a handgun was something that you would recognise as such, but you only have to go back. The fowler is mentioned in the Bible. Egyptian tombs are, curiously enough, many of the Egyptian tombs are decorated with hieroglyphs that show clearly identifiable bird species, pintail, greylag. There are people shown hunting them with bows and arrows, throwing sticks. You know, wildfowling is as old as man. It's easily 4,000 years old.
Lots of ducks and they taste quite good, I suppose.
Exactly, and it probably goes right back into the mists of time. So what we're doing effectively is not something new. It's just that we have a raft of slightly more modern methods of dealing with the old problems. So going back to what we were saying before, it takes place on the coast. The coast means the area is tidal. And perhaps before I get too much into the technicality of the thing, if we just have a look at how the wildfowling system around the coastline works. Most coastal wildfowling, not all, but most coastal wildfowling takes place on ground that is rented by clubs. So if you're looking to get into wildfowling, you're looking to join a wildfowling club. A good place to start is get in touch with Basque. Basque do an excellent booklet that details all of the Basque affiliated wildfowling clubs around the coast, what their membership fees are, what the conditions are for membership, and a contact point for someone, you know, to make an introduction to the association. I would say at that point, here we are in June, if you're thinking about joining a wildfowling club, now is a good time to do it, because there's sometimes quite a bit of admin for the club to do when taking on a new member. A lot of clubs, my club being one of them, we don't normally take people on past the start of September because of the amount of work that it takes. So if you're thinking about joining a wildfowling club, don't leave it till the 1st of September because you could well be too late. There are other clubs that are outside of BASC. One of the best known ones is the Kent Wildfowlers. It's centred, as its name implies, in Kent, but has shooting holdings as far afield as Norfolk, to the north, Essex, and down into East Sussex. They do a lot of work with other wildfowling associations.
Who owns the ground then, if they're rented, or is it rented off private individuals, or is it rented off the government, local sort of
another
authorities?
Another excellent question. Yes, is the answer. all of those and a few others. In terms of the size of the areas that are leased by the clubs, some of the larger areas technically belong to the Crown Estate. There's a bit of history there. No, we'll put that to one side for the moment. The clubs get their lease from the Crown. The Crown have a fairly standardised process of dealing with wildfowling clubs. The wildfowling clubs submit a bag return to the Crown at the end of every year. Other clubs will lease from whoever is the appropriate landowner. It might be a local authority, it might be a private landowner. Some people think for some reason that you can't privately own land below the mean high water mark. Well, of course you can.
It must date back quite a way, that ownership, though. I was going to say, it's not something you can purchase now, unfortunately.
It's not something that you can, well, if it's legitimately owned, you could go out and buy it, and indeed that's exactly what some clubs have done. But
you're not privatising more.
But no, this was all divvied up a very long time ago. So what you're not likely to do is to go to the shore and find a piece of ground that actually doesn't belong to somebody. And the way the law works is if it doesn't belong to someone, then technically it reverts to the Crown in any event. That's a potted history, but that's about the gist of it. So we've had a very quick look at clubs. Their membership fees go from anything to tens of pounds up to many hundreds. And the fee would probably reflect what you're going to get for your money. I'll take the Kent Wildfowlers as an example, simply because one of the other clubs that I'm a vice president of jointly owns a marsh with the Kent Wildfowlers. So Kent, basically you join and you have access to literally thousands upon thousands of acres of wildfowl shooting, much of it on the coast, some of it inland. Some of it is inland fresh marsh. And I suppose at that point it's worth saying that you have certain parts of the country, particularly up in the Fenn Country, a strip that runs from Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, up to the shore of the Wash, often known as the Inland Washes, which has a long tradition of almost coastal wildfowling. It's a bit more than duck shooting, and duck shooting, I think, if I was to describe it charitably, could be as little as a party of guns sitting around a fed flight pond. Not a huge amount of fieldcraft involved in doing that.
There's a touch of snobbery, perhaps, from a wildfowling perspective.
There's
your walk up the river, flush a mallard, pop it, put it in the fridge sort of person, or a fed flight pond shooting.
There is.
Ducks,
I think there's probably a huge amount of inverted snobbery in that. What I would say about wildfowling is that it's more about fieldcraft with a modest amount of shooting, rather than at the other end of the scale, which might be a fed flight pond, where you would have lots of shooting but no fieldcraft. Yeah. So my personal attraction to wildfowling, apart from the area that it takes place, is the fact that it requires a considerable investment, particularly in time and acquisition of skill, to become good at it.
Significant amount more fair chase.
Yes, that's a very good way of describing it. Very, very much, it's a fair chase, a kind of scenario with that figures quite highly. It is often said that you can remember that a wildfowler, particularly if you do a lot of goose shooting, and I'm talking about grey geese here. I've heard wildfowlers say, I've been shooting for 40 or 50 years and I can remember practically every goose I've ever shot. Yeah. And I think that's something that your average pheasant or pigeon shooter probably couldn't say, simply because the type of shooting is different.
The quantity is significantly higher, generally speaking.
Yeah, but it just kind of puts into perspective the fact that the bagging of a duck or goose on the foreshore under the bird's own conditions, so to speak, will probably provide you with a different kind of satisfaction than shooting something else under different circumstances might, if that makes sense.
No, certainly.
So, what have we done? We've touched on clubs, we've looked at some of the fees.
Stuff, basic gear.
Let's look first at the basics. I think the basics are as simple really as you want to make them. In the clip that we did last year when we looked at guns, whatever is the cheapest, most appropriate gun is a
60 or 70 quid a cut it sort of thing.
You could literally buy a gun for less than 100 quid, which would serve your purposes.
It might be a throwaway item by the end of the season, but for 60 or 70 quid.
It gets a foot in the door.
Indeed.
Again, something else with wildfowling as a very quick aside, you will find that the salt environment and the mud will eat equipment, including guns. So you do need to make sure that they're kept clean. But otherwise, you'll see your investment of
Is that cut for clothing as well?
Certainly clothing, and I think we touched upon that.
We have done indeed.
Yes, in terms of at least having a read of the manufacturer's instructions and giving it a wash every now and then will make it last a bit longer. So you could probably get away with a pair of short Wellington boots during your first season. It has to be said that some marshes, and no two marshes around the coast are the same. In many, you would need a minimum of thigh boots, and there are indeed some where you wouldn't get away with anything less than full chest waders, but you would be guided in that by your club. Most clubs would provide you with at least a list of the basic equipment that you'd need in order to get started.
Some marshes you need a boat to start.
Exactly, very much so. The amount of money that you can spend on the equipment ranges from next to nothing up to
carbon fibre stealth duck hunting boats.
Indeed, you could. And again, as we touched upon before, if you go into some of the more obscure branches of it, like punt gunning, then you just as well take your checkbook out and just set light to the individual checks, because you could just throw money at it. But let's go back for a moment to the sort of cheaper end of the scale. Any waterproof clothing that you would wear in the field will suffice. Doesn't have to be camouflage at all. A couple of things that perhaps I'll come on to in a moment, where things start to converge away from the mainstream, but a decent jacket, suitable clothing, boots as we've just discussed, a hat of some description, and preferably a jacket with a hood. If you suffer from cold hands, you'll want gloves, and you'll want something to carry that in, which might be a side bag like mine that we'll look at in a moment. Many people favour like a rucksack type of bag. I don't, simply because I've got problems with my shoulders. But if we just look for a moment at guns, if I just grab my gun slip, I'm a great fan of these, not necessarily this make, but the concept of a floating gun slip. Not only does it provide padding, but certainly in my club, at some point you're going to end up in a boat, and having lost a gun overboard in a non-floating gun slip, and it's amazing how quickly an almost new 3-inch AYA number 3, this was long before steel, will sink to the bottom of a 40-foot deep channel in a non-floating gun slip. This actually works. If you chuck a gun in the water, it will float.
Tested it in the bath first.
I've tested it in the bath with an old gun, and it's well worth investing in something like this.
Surprised me it's not like a seal bag, so you can roll the end over and actually sort of a proper flotation sack.
Like a flotation device. Yeah. Yes, I sometimes wonder that.
Oh, well, nobody has come up with that idea.
No.
And obviously your trusty...
Thank you, sir. I use a semi-automatic, particularly when I'm out after the big stuff, because this has got a 3.5-inch chamber. Again, we talked previously about some of the attendant ballistics with specialist, particularly steel, wildfowling cartridges. We won't go over that again, but something that is important on a wildfowling gun is a sling. Wouldn't be without mine. And I'll just throw this into the mix. A friend of mine bought one of these the other day, which is a spacer, a rubber spacer for the Benelli Comfortex stock. Now, if like me, you're 6'4", although I'm kind of shrinking a bit, and you're 6 foot
And a bit.
and quite a bit, one of the issues that I've always had with Benellis, which have had notoriously short...
14 and a quarter out the box, aren't they?
Exactly, they're built for midgets, and even with the longer stock extension, it's still not long enough. Yeah. There is a way, or there was, indeed there still is a way, that you can kind of cobble something together, but it's costly. The other alternative is a simple slip-on sleeve, which frankly looks incredibly...
around like
and
a good one
it's ugly as sin. But this, it fits into the Comfort Tech stock in the same way that the recoil pad does, and the recoil pad fits into the extension in the same way. But the difference is that now that gun comes up exactly where
it should.
Where it should. I've got the option, because this is the longer conventional stock extension, that if I want to put the shorter one on for winter wear when I'm wearing thick clothing, I can. That's available on eBay if you put Benelli rubber stock lengthener into their search engine. And for all the tall people that go wildfowling,
that's a good thing.
Take a look at that.
One of the things that gun fit probably matters more when wildfowling, purely because, unlike when you're pheasant shooting, you can kind of find yourself and you've got time to make up for it. Your opportunities may be singular or nil.
Well, if on a good day, if they're singular or in sort of multiples of single, you don't have time to get your eye in. One of the things with wildfowling is that always the better shots that come home with more birds at the end of the day, simply because they make the most of the opportunities that they get. And for those of you like me who are tall Benelli users, that will make a world of difference. Surprised it's taken so long for someone to actually do it.
Surprised me, Benelli just don't make adult-sized guns, to be honest.
You really would think so, but they're notorious for not listening to what their customers have been asking for years.
We'd have to buy a new mould. They've been using the same mould for plastic stocks for years and years. So
as much as I like Benelli guns, but back to the task in hand. I wonder perhaps if I just go through perhaps the contents of my game bag and we just take a quick look at where it differs from some of the more conventional stuff. The
bag is significantly bigger.
The bag itself is a lot bigger than all of the ones that you can buy over the shelf, over the counter. And of course the reason for that is that nobody actually makes a side style game bag that you can put 3 Canada geese in. This will take 3 Canadas, 5 pink feet, a number of duck, and an awful load of other odds and sods, as we will see forthwith. The area that I shoot a lot in consists, as do many others, of a lot of mud. So one of the first things that you need to master in technical terms is the use of good old-fashioned mud patterns. And I think perhaps at some point in the future we ought to do a comedy video on the shore with someone taking their first step or steps in mud patterns. They're almost idiot proof. When it's done properly, they are safe. Done wrongly, and they're extremely dangerous. And the comedy value of somebody sinking up to their knees and beyond with the mud pattern itself stuck 2 feet down in the mud with the tide coming in is absolutely superb. Mud patterns have been around for hundreds of years. Again, it's not a new piece of technology, but it's one of those sort of facets of fowling that really does begin to sort of separate the men from the boys in terms of knowing what you're doing out.
A necessary kit, do you reckon? It depends on the marsh.
Depends on the marsh. So, some of them you won't get very far without them, and others, indeed, they would be completely unnecessary. But I bring them along just to, illustrate the fact that they exist. As far as the bag is concerned, something that I do is I put a a plastic bag inside the bag into which all my bits and pieces go. The reason for that being, of course, if I put 3 Canada geese in the bag that are bleeding everywhere,
your stuff's going to be fairly rotten.
Everything's going to be covered in blood. So yes, you can see the logic in that. And also, because I have an aversion to sitting in the damp, I've had piles, I don't want them again. A simple kneeling pad like this one, available from any garden centre, but don't forget a bit of string and tie it to your game bag, because it
will blow away and float away.
Exactly that will stop it from leaving you high and dry. I don't know what else I've got in here. Oh yes, a cartridge belt.
Ready to go, obviously.
Ready to go. My favourite ammunition at the moment is the 36 gram Ely 3-inch cartridge. It comes in a variety of configurations, works extremely well. I prefer a cartridge belt because obviously I say obviously it's not. I would wear mine underneath my jacket because there it's got the maximum amount of protection from the elements. No cartridge manufacturer today manufactures a cartridge with a true brass head.
It'd be very expensive.
Indeed, these are all plated. It doesn't last very long because this is a one use.
Steel underneath, isn't it?
Exactly.
So it rots fairly nicely.
The less you can expose that to the salt environment, the longer that's going to last.
It's about the only sort of experience I've had where a cartridge belt was actually quite a good thing was when I came out with you.
Yes, yeah.
Other than that, I am a bag man.
Yeah, I would use one for
pigeons,
pheasants,
anything, yeah.
Undoubtedly. But for wildfowling,
where you need a selection and you don't need much more than a box.
Spare dog lead.
A dog, obviously.
A dog.
We had an appropriate one to show.
And yes, here's one I made earlier. A lot of people who are new to the sport of shooting, don't have a dog, are put off of wildfowling for that very reason.
Well, your club demands a dog, so
the club demands a dog, but what we don't expect is that you will have one. So we do 2 things. All of our new members will be accompanied during their first season. That's to stop them from killing themselves, to make sure that they're safe on the marsh. They know what they're doing.
Accidentally, as opposed to frustrated.
Yes, in a fit of depression. But we also team them up by various means with someone who does have a dog. So the new member gets plenty of shooting, but they don't have to rush out and invest in a dog, which is a minimum 2-year investment, or at least a 1-year investment before you'd think about taking it out, and a considerable amount of time.
Without chucking 4 or 5 grand in for a trained dog.
Exactly. So if you haven't got a dog, don't worry about it. There are ways around that. We also provide extensive training facilities for the people who do join the club without a dog, decide that wildfowling is for them, and subsequently invest in a dog. You never really want to try to start training your own dog without some sort of input from someone whose dog you've seen working, and you know that the dog is capable of doing the tasks that it's required. So kind of that's dogs. Back to the contents of my bag. I haven't looked in here for some time, so I should be intrigued to see what's in there.
Since February, more than likely.
Probably, yes. Because of the mud, at some point you will get some of it stuck up the barrel of your gun. A pull through is of no use, because if the plug of mud in the end of your barrel is thick clay, you will not dislodge it with anything. So that's a crude but effective
poking stick
with but that's sealed the bore, if you see what I mean.
Yep.
That will get anything out of the barrel. The idea of the cable ties is just to keep it all together.
As opposed to a standard 3-piece rod that might not be quite so handy.
Exactly, and if I drop it, it'll float. So that's easy enough. Cheap pair of binoculars. Don't laugh. £7.50 from Lidl's.
I bet they have beautifully optically.
And they are usable. But at £7.50.
What do you use them for?
Very often, if you're sat on the shore, it's useful to be able to see what's out on the mud in front of you. Is that bunch of geese 200 or 300 yards out, is it Brent sitting at the tide's edge, or is it a bunch of Canadas?
Yeah.
You know, that there might be some point in calling or whatever. Always on a marsh, because it's so big and so flat, handy to have optical equipment of some sort. I've usually got a pair of slightly better quality binoculars, but again...
You don't mind leaving those in your bag, do you?
You don't. £1,000 and plus pair of Zeiss binoculars won't like the salt environment anymore.
However, Swarovski will honour warranty on wildfowl damaged binos, so...
I'd be interested to have a go with those, just to see whether it does apply to the salt environment. Torch, decent torch, always worth having. Duck calls, we looked at those previously. An absolute godsend on the shore once you've mastered them. On a good day, particularly if I'm using decoys, with both mallard and Canada geese in particular, on a good day I can turn birds around and they're flying away and bring them back again.
As we saw.
Yeah.
As we saw.
So that's well worth the time and trouble of investing. I always take a selection of hats, not so much that I've got a hat fetish, simply that if it's peeing with rain and you're stuck out on a tidal island for 5 or 6 hours,
a dry hat to put back on your head is quite nice.
Exactly, having a dry hat that you can change into every couple of hours is very useful.
You see the 5 pairs of underwear for the same reason.
Yes, there's some paper there for the appropriate paperwork if you have a need to do that. Get
caught short.
Indeed. So that's pretty much the contents of my bag. I've got a pair of gloves in there, although I'm not a great glove wearer because I'm fortunate and I don't suffer from cold hands. One of the things that I would recommend that you get used to doing if you're out on the shore on a cold day and your hands start to get cold, if you put your hands in the sea or fresh water, if that's all you've got, and leave them there for a couple of seconds and take them out and just air dry them, momentarily your hands will get even colder. But then your heart will do instinctively what it does, which is to pump more blood to the cold area. So I've seen people sit there with hands so cold that they could barely pull the trigger and would certainly struggle to reload a semi-automatic because they just can't hold the cartridges. So knowing that little trick to keep your hands in working condition is well worth it. It sounds completely counterintuitive, but it actually works extremely well. And if I may, if we're kind of randomly looking at stuff, tide table, and knowing how to read it and what it means for the area that you're shooting in.
Necessary kit if you want to be successful.
Well, in many areas, it's an absolutely necessary piece of kit for actually keeping you alive. Up on the east coast, you get tidal surges. On the west coast, the Bristol Channel has something like a 40 tidal rise and fall. It comes in like an express train, and if you've miscalculated the tides,
you will die.
And you will die. It's as simple as that. It's a lot more benign in this part of the world, but you can still get a serious wetting if you completely cock up your tidal calculations.
Unless you have a boat.
Unless you have a boat. We talked a moment ago about decoys. They can be a significant investment for a wildfowler in an area where decoying is something which is done. There are there are many places.
And that's a regional difference.
Yeah, it's down to the type of marsh that you shoot.
Some marshes it just doesn't work, or some you need it.
Some marshes are what you might call flighting marshes. They are marshes that occur between the open foreshore, virtually the open sea, and the land and perhaps a fresh marsh behind the seawall, and you're intercepting birds that fly from one place to the other.
So you're just trying to get them a bit lower?
A bit lower, but there simply may not be the opportunity to put the decoys out. There may be no water. Where I shoot, you've got tidal islands, So as the tide rises, the birds are flushed from wherever they might be to some more favoured areas to keep out of the wind, keep out of the chop, so to speak. And it's that and where the decoys and the calls come into their own. You can pay £5, £6, £7 for a decent sort of proprietary, in this case mallard, or you can go into your local cheap shop and buy these teal decoys at 99 pence each, and they work extremely well. The only thing is they're slightly more brittle plastic, and occasionally
take a look at the looking after.
If they get shot, they don't tend to like it quite so much as these, which are slightly more rubbery. But again, in terms of investment, a tenner would buy you 10 of these. In effect,
can you paint them the colour of other ducks, or does the size matter that much?
That's another good question, and there's a whole variety of different schools of thought. Mine, after a lifetime's wildfowling, is that usually it doesn't really matter. If it's duck shaped and it's in the right place,
and you're banging away on a call as well, I would have thought.
You've got a call and you're blowing it properly, and perhaps as importantly, you're properly hidden, and you hold the gun straight at the end of the day. Often the conditions where you will get the majority of the duck or goose movement coincide with very poor light. So if the birds can't see the colours, what's the point? Yeah. Equally, there are places, there are people who will be decoying in the middle of the day, and it is fair to say that every detail of the duck, all the colours, the shape, the way that it's floating, are significantly enhanced. It's interesting to see the difference between Great Britain, where we are allowed to shoot we could shoot all night if you wanted to, but you're allowed to shoot in significantly less strong light conditions at dawn and dusk than is the case in America, where you can't shoot until the sun is up and you must stop when the sun goes down, which is one of the reasons why American decoys are often much better detailed, because they're always shooting in clear daylight. So for those of you who already indulge in a bit of wildfowling, I kind of thought of that last year. If the weight comes off of the decoy's head or around the body, depending how you wind it in a decoy bag, you can end up with a huge bird's nest of tangled decoy lines. By simply doing that, it can't come off. You can bounce that up and down in a decoy bag and it'll stay there. When you deploy the decoy, you even get a little bit of elasticity in it, which will stop, in a bit of a slop, the bird from jerking around on the end of the decoy, on the end of the line. So again, decoys, there's a whole issue there on their own. Just to finish the decoy part of it, on this, I'm a great fan of these Silla Sock decoys, which are like a one-dimensional, two-dimensional decoy. Again, particularly for the kind of shooting that I do, of Canadas, which is mainly at flight. Having a dozen of these out on the mud in front of you and using a call can significantly increase your chances. These are lightweight, easy to deploy, but of course there is a price to them, like all things.
They're not cheap, but they're not that expensive either. Silla Socks.
I thoroughly recommend them, and they are certainly reasonably priced. But let's not lose sight of the fact, particularly if you're of my sort of age, when I started wildfowling, most of this stuff you couldn't buy, so you'd have to make it yourself. A dozen of these, yes, they are completely one-dimensional, but spread out in front of you, they have the desired effect of just attracting the bird's attention long enough to make them come that little bit closer towards you. 10 minutes with a few spray cans and a bandsaw.
And it's good enough.
And it's good enough, that's all you need.
Yeah.
So,
like you say, it's likely to be low light anyway, so
yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yes, and it's just to make the point that if you look at this and think, God, what's that lot going to cost me? If you go to the top of the range, it could cost you an arm and a leg.
you can get started wildfowling for 400 or 500 quid all in.
A lot less, in all probability, if you've got a little bit of ingenuity.
Yeah.
What have we left out?
Not a great deal, really. It was quite good. Top tips to new wildfowlers.
Top tips to new wildfowlers. Spend time looking particularly on places like YouTube, where there's a lot of wildfowling stuff, across the board really. You're into a whole new world of concealment. This is not pheasant shooting where you can stand in the open and the birds will fly across you, in front of you. It's a step ahead from pigeon shooting, where you will need, in pigeon shooting obviously you need to remain hidden, but very often the topography of the ground is
Allows
such
you to tuck yourself in.
Precisely, you've got a hedge, you've got a hide. When you're on the foreshore,
do you use hides on the foreshore?
often I do. Again, that's another area to itself. I didn't bring any of the hide stuff with me today.
Just a simple blind, nothing too
A simple.
serious.
It can be anything from a simple net hide to one of the areas that we have. It's got pit hides,
Nice.
which are hides where you sit where your eyes are at ground level, and that's an interesting experience. So, like all these things, they go from one extreme to the other. Sorry, I've lost the thread. What were we talking about?
Top tips.
Top tips. Yeah, research the thing as much as you can, and that includes bird identification. There are something like, don't quote me on this, I think there are something like 16 quarry species that you can legitimately shoot, but that's out of probably the best part of 200 species that you might see on the shore at any one time. You need to have a pretty reasonable working knowledge of all of that.
Buy a bird book.
Buy a bird book.
Be a good investment.
Yes, again, YouTube, the old favourite. If you type widgeon into YouTube, it comes up with film after film after film of widgeon doing everything that widgeon do, so that you can become more familiar with their flight silhouettes, their calls, their habits, what they eat, etc. I mean, and again, this is what I find so fascinating about wildfowling. Pheasant shooting, no disrespect, you rock up on the day, or you could pay your money, you'd stand on a peg and you'd have a very good day's pheasant shooting, but you wouldn't actually need to acquire an awful lot in terms of knowledge.
There is a basic knowledge that people should certainly know.
Indeed.
But it's nowhere near the sort of level of knowledge you need for wildfowling.
And
many other country sports.
Yes, and it's this ongoing investment in skills, bird identification skills, etc., etc. I don't know, as a random sort of aside, a capable wildfowler will be able to hold his own in a group of capable bird watchers and twitchers with no interest in shooting, simply because he knows what he's doing.
Probably has spent vastly more hours sat there at sunrise staring at these things.
Indeed. So, yeah, top tips.
Educate yourself.
Educate yourself. That's a good one. One of my other top tips, which pertains to anything to do with shooting a shotgun, is at some stage in your career, and preferably nearer the beginning than the end, you really need to invest a not inconsiderable sum, but it's money well spent on shooting lessons.
Yes.
Because the number of people that I see, particularly on the shore, and you think, yeah, you know, you've got, here come the Canada geese, you know, you're concealed, the birds haven't seen you.
Everything's right.
They're coming on, you know, 50, 25 yards, they're at optimum range, up goes the gun, bang, bang, bang sometimes, and they hit absolutely nothing. And you think, yeah, okay, you're getting the hang of it, but really the thing which is the pinnacle of what you're there for, you're still struggling with because you haven't invested any time in learning how to shoot.
Mm. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I'm with you. And that goes for all walks of life with a shotgun.
Indeed.
Why would you spend a significant amount on a pheasant day in the same sort of regard and not know what you're doing? It seems a waste.
Yes.
Almost. But you might enjoy it nonetheless.
Indeed. And I don't hold any of this against pheasant shooters. I'm always open to an offer of a peg on a day's pheasant shooting.
Yeah, it's a very different day out though, isn't it?
Indeed.
Well, you don't have to wake up at 4 in the morning for
No,
a start.
well, yes, you do have to get used to getting up at very early, stupid o'clock in the morning, because most wildfowling will take place at dawn and dusk. Quite a bit of it during the day, but mostly it's early mornings and late evenings.
Very good. Have you any concluders on the subject?
No, I suppose one of them might be sort of randomly. I occasionally, through the sort of the various electronic mediums, which allow you to have a discourse with more people than would be the case if you were doing this face to face. Often, I talk to people, and they're interested in taking up shooting, but wildfowling, for some reason, kind of puts them off because it involves too much effort and too much of a step into the unknown as far as they're concerned. Well, everybody had to start at some point. Everybody's been where you are. Nobody will take the mickey out of you. You'll get an awful lot of help and assistance there if you want it. But most importantly is the fact that if you join a wildfowling club and you're new to shooting and don't know anybody else apart from the few blokes that you've met at the clay shoot, that wildfowling club will probably contain the people who've got all the pigeon shooting within 25 or 30 miles sewn up, and they're the people that you really need to be making friends with, because they're the ones that can give you access to a much, much wider shooting area.
So there's a good community within the clubs.
Again, you've put it better than me. It's an excellent way of networking, and even if wildfowling doesn't turn out to be your main kind of interest in shooting life, maintaining a contact and a membership with a wildfowling club, it enables you to have contact with other people that branch out into all sorts of other forms of shooting.
There is something very attractive about wildfowling that it's something you can't buy into. Something you can't buy your way to the top with. No. With stalking, you can pretty much buy your way to the top. You can go shoot the best buck, have some money, we'll go. If you want to go pheasant shooting, pay the right amount of money, go shoot the best shoots. But wildfowling, you do need to invest time, education, and that in itself is kind of off-putting to a lot of people, but that's nice.
Yeah. Don't bite the bullet, give it a go.
And that's as simple as that. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Take care, goodbye, and we'll see you next time.